webinar in our pursuit to enable ourselves and to enrich ourselves with the knowledge of the speakers who have immense knowledge, and their knowledge being shared on this platform gives us a different facet of thought process. And amongst us in that pursuit, we have Honorable Mr. Justice A.M. Thipse, former judge of the Bombay High Court, who prior to his elevation in the High Court had practices in his civil and criminal courts in Mumbai, and thereafter he was appointed in the Maharashtra Judicial Services as a judge in the City Civil and Sessions Court. Justice Thipse had presided over the Vadodara Best Bakery retrial case, which had been transferred to Mumbai, that every lawyer, every student, any public at large knows about this case. And he has also a great taste towards what we say chess, and his brother also has created a niche. And it is very fortuitous, as they say, that being a lawyer is a mind game and a brother being in the chess game. So a common point which we say the chess, how to work about it, because they say once you get a trial, you also have to think what is the best move forward for the client. These, while we will be discussing the topic of human rights, criminal law perspective and safeguards, which itself is an engaging a topic for everyone, but we would also like to know his insights as to how this chess, etc., had also inspired after the end of the session. And as usual, we will have the question answers session, which the participants, those who are watching us live on the Facebook and on the platform, can post either on the Facebook or on the chat box. The learned speaker has kindly consented to give the insights. Thank you, sir, and welcome. And can you just keep the camera slightly low because your head is like.
Camera low, just I will try.
Yes, yeah, so perfect.
Okay? So, okay, now?
Slightly up, yes. Thank you. It's perfect, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, so I am audible, no? Clearly?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Audible.
I am audible, no?
Perfect, sir. Perfect.
So, okay. And now the camera also, I believe, is all right, because I can't visualize how you are able to see there.
Yes, sir. I'm seeing it perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So should we start right away?
Yes, sir. Right off.
Yes. Hello, friends. First, I must begin with congratulating Beyond Law, because when they invited me, they gave me the details of their activities, and I found that they almost covered every subject, invited every legal luminary, and properly utilized this pandemic time. So I must congratulate them, and then we begin for today's session. Now, I have been speaking generally before the judges only, because I visit National Judicial Academy quite often, and generally I'm invited on all topics of criminal law whenever there are any important seminars or even international seminars are there. But I have realized one thing, because in this pandemic I addressed the seminars or webinars of lawyers, and at that time I did realize that though the lawyers are also concerned with law, the judges are also concerned with law, what one would need to speak before judges and what one would like to speak before the lawyers would not be the same. So anyway, I'm just, my idea is that, in such webinars, there should be exchange of ideas, and it should provoke you to think in those directions on which the discussion would take place. The idea can never be like a teacher is teaching students of LLB class, because most of you are quite experienced already in law. And I think such webinars should actually contribute to provoking you into thinking about the rationality of the law, rationality of the system which works in practice, the challenges which we have to meet. So from that point of view, I think today's subject is very important. First we begin with what are human rights. Of course, you know that briefly. Human rights may be regarded as those fundamentals and inalienable rights which are essential for the life as human being. These are not the rights given to you by any enactment or by any statute, but it is accepted that just by virtue of your being a human being, you possess certain rights. And this is recognized in all civilizations, all modern times. Of course, there have been these international conventions, and many countries have legislations. But before that also, something like human rights were recognized. Now, they don't belong to any race, religion, they just belong to all human beings. So these are in one sense called as fundamental rights, and without which we can't really live as human beings. We can't develop and use our qualities. This is the theory of human rights. We don't want to spend more time on discussing what is the concept of human rights, because we are concerned with the human rights vis-a-vis the application of the criminal justice system. See, the criminal justice system we must have, and every country has, it is with the object of punishing the offenders who contravene the law, who commit offenses, and who are therefore thought to be dangerous to the society, or whose activities are thought to be dangerous to the societies. We have a set rule of what amounts to an offense, a penal offense. We have procedures by which such offenders are to be tried. And then we have punishments which are prescribed in accordance with law to those who are found guilty of having committed those offenses. Now, in this, the concept of punishment and the concept of human rights, sometimes they may clash, because to a certain extent, the investigatory procedure will require arrest, detention of the suspected criminal, search, affecting his privacy to a certain extent. All these will theoretically be in conflict with the human rights which he possesses. But we have to counterbalance that, because the human rights have been restricted, restrictions have been permitted by the law itself. Now, let us begin with the Declaration of Human Rights. You know that it was of 1948. It has been ratified by our country. And what is important is that this has been recognized by converting it into the law. You know, the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993, which was enacted. So now it doesn't remain a matter of an international convention only. It has now become the law of the land. Means we have those rules. This is a part of these articles or these principles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have become law of this land. Now, these Universal Declaration defines human rights as those minimum rights that every individual must have against the state and other public authority by virtue of being a member of human family, irrespective of any other consideration. Now, you must be aware that at about the time when the declaration was made, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights was made, the Constitution was being drafted. Our Indian Constitution was being drafted. And it would be quite interesting for you to note that all these human rights which are found in the declaration and now in the Act, Protection of Human Rights Act, are already there in the Constitution. You know, Indian Constitution recognizes these rights, and in fact, the Code of Criminal Procedure also recognizes these rights. So basically, if you study, you will realize immediately that all the human rights are actually fundamental rights. Just something wrong. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello? No, you are able to hear me, no? I thought some...
Slightly, if it can be slight audibility, I am hearing it, but I had posted also, people are saying it's audible, but I feel slightly it can be louder.
All right, I will...
So, and meanwhile, I will just welcome Justice Roshan Dalvi, who has joined us. I will unmute Justice Roshan Dalvi.
Yeah. Hello, Roshan.
I'm just unmuting her.
Yeah.
Roshan Dalvi.
Hello, Roshan.
So just 1 minute. We are unmuting because we mute everyone.
Okay.
Yes, sir. She has joined us.
Yes.
Hello, Roshan. Nice to know that you are there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you. See, now the point which I was making is that all these human rights are included in the Constitution and also in the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, see, the criminal justice system which we administer must be in consonance with the constitutional goals and the constitutional principles. I will just make some comparison of the rights mentioned in the Universal Declaration and those contained in the Constitution, either as fundamental rights or some of the rights you can also find in the Code of Criminal Procedure. But before that, we must not lose sight of Article 13(2) of the Constitution, which says that the state shall not make any law which takes away the fundamental rights. So therefore, you know, one has to understand when these rights are simply in the Code of Criminal Procedure, and when the rights, though they are also in Criminal Procedure Code, they are basically flowing from the Constitution. There is an important distinction, because if the rights are having constitutional origins, then the legislature cannot amend the law very easily by taking away those rights, because for that they will have to amend the Constitution, and as you know, the Constitution cannot be amended in such a way so as to change its basic structure. So these fundamental rights which are guaranteed by the Constitution, they cannot be taken away, and the criminal justice system has to be in consonance with the provisions in the Constitution. Now I will proceed to make some interesting comparison, you know, that to show that there is not basically any difference between the fundamental rights as mentioned in the Constitution and the human rights which we recognize. So maybe I will just make a reference to some of the provisions only. See, Article 20, we may begin, because these are fundamental principles of these criminal jurisprudence. The first one, of course, is presumption of innocence, and you will not find that either in the Constitution or in the Code of Criminal Procedure, but I think that is such a fundamental presumption that it has been held that even if it comes in conflict with some other presumption, the presumption of innocence will prevail, and the other provisions will have to be read subject to that presumption. So we begin with Article 20 of the Constitution, that no person shall be convicted of an offense except for violation of the law in force at the time of the commission of the act charged as an offense. So now this, he also cannot be subjected to a greater penalty than he would have been liable for at the time when the act was committed. This article, same article, also gives protection for repeated punishment for the same offense. And you will find that this is also found in section 300. I mean that rule against double jeopardy, we call it as section 300 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Of course, the protection given by section 300 is broader than that, because the Constitution doesn't cover the cases of previous acquittal. It only says that he cannot be punished again. But Article 300, the section 300 of the Code of Criminal Procedure gives protection even in cases of acquittal from repeated prosecution, subject to, of course, certain provisions. The details of that we need not go into. But one important thing, as we said, which are all presumptions are based on the fundamental presumption of innocence of an accused. Corollary of that is that he cannot be compelled to the right against self-incrimination also. We do want to punish offenders, but not by taking material from them only. the society, the investigating agency will collect the material against a person, but they will not insist that the material to incriminate him must come from that person, and rather such type of material cannot be obtained at all. And there is a right against self-incrimination. That is also again a constitutional right in the very article. But this is, this is found in the provisions of section 313 of the Code of Criminal Procedure and also 315 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. So 313, of course, the accused is to be generally examined after the evidence of the prosecution witnesses is over. The court examines an accused and puts the evidence to him. But the idea behind that is not to cross-examine the accused under the guise of asking these questions, or not to elicit further information or further evidence of its guilt by such questioning. The idea is to enable him to explain the circumstances, enable him to explain any of the circumstances happening against him in the evidence. So this 313, that no oath is to be administered to the accused, and he shall not be liable for punishment even if the answers given by him are found to be false. Of course, it is open for the court to draw appropriate inference from his refusal to answer also, like he cannot be compelled to answer. And from the false answers also, nothing prevents the court from drawing appropriate inference. But that itself will not be sufficient for establishing his guilt. If there is other evidence and if he could offer an explanation and he doesn't offer, the court may draw appropriate inference in the fact of this case. But the fact remains that he has got a right to remain silent. Section 315 is comparatively lesser known, and I have seen the violations of that section taking place even in the judgment of some learned judges. See, that says that the accused cannot be called as a witness except on his own request in writing. I have always wondered why that writing is mentioned. What I think, because you will not find this in commentaries, that why it should be in writing only, because usually defended by advocates. They can tell the court that I want to be examined, and the court records also that. But the law says in writing. That means probably the lawmakers wanted that it should be done after deliberation. It should not be an on-the-spot decision. The person, because if you put it in writing, you think more. It will take more time for you to contemplate. That must be the idea. So that is how zealously the law protects an accused from being exposed to cross-examination. Because once he is called as a witness, or he chooses to be a witness, then of course he can't take shelter behind the right of silence, and then he will be subjected to cross-examination like any other witness. So therefore the law wants that a very considered decision should be arrived by him and requires an application in writing from him before he can be called as a witness. But what is lost sight of many times is that his refusal to examine himself as a witness or his refusal to lead any defense evidence shall not be commented on by the court or by the prosecutor. And I have seen such comments appearing in some of the judgments, maybe in a zeal or while writing these judgments, sometimes in a flow, the judge might have written, but the fact remains that no adverse inference from the evidence can be drawn unless there is already evidence of his guilt. He cannot be convicted on the basis of such failures to examine himself, etc. Now, section 132 also of the Evidence Act also protects you, that a witness can be asked any question in the cross-examination. But if he can refuse to answer a question, if the tendency of the answer would be to incriminate him. Now, witness is not excused from answering that question. Section 132 says that. But the problem what the section 132 says is that if he is compelled to answer the court has got power to compel a witness. I am not talking about the accused. The accused, of course, cannot be compelled to do that. But even a witness is given some protection when the answer is likely to incriminate him. And that protection, of course, doesn't go to the extent that he may refuse to answer, because the court has to do the discovery of truth, and for that, if he has material and relevant evidence, he cannot say that I will not give it. But section 132 says that when he is compelled to answer, such answer shall not be used against him in any prosecution against him. In other words, he is totally privileged. And I remember in that case, there is some brilliant fiction of Perry Mason. Some of you must be aware in some novel. I don't remember. I mean, read it long back when I was in college, probably. There is an interesting story that the prosecution has called a witness who is supposed to say that he found the witness is supposed to be a pickpocket, and he is supposed to picked a pocket of somebody and got a hold of a cigarette lighter, and this lighter happens to be of the deceased, whose the case of whose murder is going on, and a person is prosecuted. The prosecution case is that the accused, who is put on trial, had murdered him, and that they wanted to prove by showing that this lighter was with that person, and the witness picked his pocket and got the lighter. So the witness is to be an important witness, showing that the lighter was with the accused person, lighter of the deceased. But then the witness, he says that because then he will have to admit pickpocketing. So with that object, the prosecution is prepared, and they compel him. They give him protection that he will not be prosecuted because of your answer. Now the witness was won over by the accused, and he said that I took the lighter. He answers the question that how did this lighter come to you? He was to say that I picked the pocket of so and so and I got it from him. But he says, I took it from the deceased after murdering him. And then there is big hue and cry. This is of course a fiction. Actually, this answer is not true. And therefore, the story ultimately is something different. But this way, I mean, these provisions protect to such an extent that shrewd lawyers think of taking advantage of that such situation. Of course, when he's compared, it is very interesting, you know, that prosecutor for giving false evidence by such answer. That privilege means this answer will not subject to any prosecution or any penalty. It will not subject him to any such prosecution, even if he admits incriminating thing, except the offense of giving false evidence by such answer. So there also he is expected to speak the truth. I'm just explaining the broader concepts of the justice system, which are purely based on the recognition of human rights. Otherwise, you know, if you have truth, you are placing truth at paramount importance, there would be no necessity of giving such higher protections. Because sometimes, you know, truth may be disguised or truth may not come out because of these protections. But we have to accept this, because there is a far more important thing that would be at stake if we violate these provisions. That is, there will be violation of human rights itself. And we want to protect the human rights. And therefore, these provisions are designed to secure that human rights are protected. Now, of course, the Article 21, you know, when it was, the clause is that no person shall be deprived of his life and liberty except by procedure established by law. Those of you who had occasion to study the Constitution Assembly debates, you will find that the makers of the Constitution, they did not want a clause, due process of law, which is in the United States Constitution. Because due process means the court will have a greater opportunity to check on the process also, whether it is fair and reasonable. So these constitution makers were of the view that due process clause will cause much more interference by the courts, which they did not want it at that point of time when the Constitution was being drafted. So they said that we will use this clause, procedure established by law. Now, if you literally, once there is a procedure, once there is a law permitting a certain things, then it will not be questioned. And if you see the initial judgments of the Supreme Court, they were making a distinction between due process of law and procedure established by law. But later on, I think in Maneka Gandhi's case, particularly for the first time, the Supreme Court made certain observations which actually, practically the distinction has been abolished now. Because they say that the procedure established by law must be fair, just and reasonable. So once any procedure established by law, you can't just say that, yes, this is the procedure established by law. That is, in the sense, a law has been passed by the parliament, and therefore this is the procedure established by law. No, the courts will still say that, examine whether it is fair, just and reasonable. Now, these are the provisions. But what are the violations that take place? Now, third degree methods. It's a fact that police use third degree methods. That has been used, recognized by the Law Commission, by the Police Commission itself, and there are many reported cases where police used third degree methods. Unfortunately, these methods are practiced against persons who are already accused of some offenses, and our society is insensitive I mean, that they don't very much bother about such violations. Unfortunately, some of the judges also tend to tolerate such violations even when they are pointed out to them, but which is not correct. This would be third degree method. Beating an accused in police custody, which is common, is a serious violation of the human rights. This responsibility is basically of the magistrates, not of the judges of the higher court, because the judges of the higher courts come in picture quite late. You all know that a person is produced before a magistrate immediately on his arrest, that is within 24 hours. 24 hours is the maximum period during which a person can be kept under detention by the police without any order from the magistrate. So the magistrate has to be vigilant, but unfortunately, many times I have observed, even when I was a magistrate, even when I was a session judge, and while in the High Court also, I have seen that the magistrate, in spite of apparent evidence and marks of injuries on the person of the accused, did not order any inquiry or investigation into this aspect as to whether he was assaulted by the police. So this is one thing which we notice, these violations. Then again, speedy trial, of course. Speedy trial, that is a subject in itself, one should speak. Speedy trial, some serious offenses. I was shocked in connection with some other work. I was doing some research, and I found that not even one PMLA case has been over so far in Bombay. The first one is registered in 2011, and not even a charge has been framed in any of these cases. I don't know how many of you are aware of that. These are more in Mumbai, these cases. I tell you, the charge sheets are running from 12,000 pages to 48,000 pages. And you know, the prevention of money laundering, it is to be preceded by a scheduled offense. Means earlier there is a police investigation, some scheduled offense is committed, wealth is generated as a result of that scheduled offenses, like sale of narcotics, maybe cheating, corruption, whatever, 420. And then that money is laundered. Then the money is tried to be given a legitimate origin, and there the offense under PMLA takes place. Now there is a confusion in my mind also as to how the trials of these offenses would proceed. I will not discuss deeper, because that's a subject. In fact, after having a lot of experience also, I am not very clear, because you know, the case of the scheduled offense is a police case based on a charge sheet, where you have to just frame a charge on finding a privacy case after going through the charge sheet, where the PMLA case is based on a complaint. And for a complaint, if it is a warrant case, you have to record evidence before charge. Now, so many questions are, and the result is that the trials are pending for framing charge. I am not joking. This is the information which I got. The only cases which are over are by way of discharge. No trial has commenced. Forget about getting over. So 8-9 hours period for framing charge, in which generally the accused would be in prison for 3 to 4 years, because these are very serious offenses. Nobody feels any sympathy for these offenders, and because of the figures quoted, the amounts of money found in the charge sheet. Now, when we see how do one tackle with such type of cases, with 48 pages charge sheet, 12,000 pages charge sheet, so many sections, so many statements, so many applications, so many accused, 19-20 accused, everyone making some application for discharge, for cancellation of warrant. So this is the way. I mean, this is, of course, I'm just putting it before you, because as I said, we don't reflect at the system. Lawyers are experienced, they are busy with their individual cases. Nobody actually sees what sort of problems this system is facing. And when we sometimes realize of this problem, we tend to find out some solution which may not be a proper solution, because we are ignoring the real problem. We just feel temporarily that somebody is escaping punishment or is unnecessarily brought into the dock, and take temporary measures. But the main problems, they continue. Anyway, this, I'm just putting my thoughts into your mind. You will see what to do. You think as officers of the court and therefore part of this system, you must think in what way the system can be changed. Law commission invites suggestions and all that, but I find that lawyers hardly participate in that. For judges also, for that matter, I see many don't reply to the question because everybody is busy with his own work. But this is also very important, and the lawyers, particularly those who have experience of criminal practice, must think in this direction, that how and when we are going to start these trials and when are we going to finish them. And if the trials are pending like that after filing of the charge sheet for 8 years, 9 years without framing charge, is it not a serious violation of human rights? Even if the accused is on bail, initially remains in custody, that is undoubtedly a serious violation of the rights. But even later, to be dragged to the court without any progress, when matters are being simply adjourned, when he doesn't come for one date, a non-bailable warrant is issued, and the plight of the accused in those matters where his guilt is not yet established is something which is a serious violation of human rights. One must understand the scheme of the provision of the Code of Criminal Procedure. You will remember section 167. The police can't detain for more than 24 hours. Thereafter, the magistrate can detain from time to time, but there is a time limit for that also. It's not that the person can be kept on under detention even by a judicial officer for an indefinite time. Section 167 places the maximum limit for which a person can be detained while the matter is under investigation. Thereafter, the police must come with a final report, or else the court has to release the accused on bail. So this I am just pointing out because this is indicative of the policy of the law. In some of the serious offenses, the courts have been empowered to extend this period, but that too again by say some further 90 days and not beyond that. So the policy of the law is very evident from this, that no, whatever may be the seriousness of the offense and whatever, it may be a 5 murder case, it may be a fraud of crores of rupees, if you can't complete investigation within that specified time, then bail has to be granted irrespective of the merits of the matter. And the accused, only condition will be that the accused will have to give sufficient security. So these provisions are indicative that the legislature has been always conscious of human rights while providing for punishment, while providing for a procedure for trial of offenders. Now the concept comes of fair trial. Fair trial was always recognized as a principle, though Code of Criminal Procedure or our constitution doesn't use this term. Fair trial is, however, specifically recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Articles 9 and 10 refer to that. But what are the basic attributes of a fair trial? The accused, every person accused of an offense is entitled to have a fair trial. And there can be, there can't be, we can't actually explain what are the concepts by way of illustrations, what are the concepts of the fair trial. That is, first, there should be no arbitrary arrest or detention. Then the person must be told as soon as he is arrested that what are the reasons for his arrest, and information of what he has been done as per the allegation, it is to be given to him. Then production before the judge or magistrate immediately. I am not referring to the provisions, you know, all these provisions, that is also under the Code of Criminal Procedure and also a constitutional requirement. Maximum 24 years, 24 hours, the period of journey. Then torture and inhuman degrading treatment cannot be given. Now these are pre-trial, I mean the pre-trial safeguards, I think, against violation of human rights. The comparison which I wanted to make is that now this Article 14, right to equality, that is also human rights declaration, that is to be treated equally before the court, and that is considered as a essential concept of a fair trial. Then presumption of innocence, though we all follow and it's a part of our criminal jurisdiction, criminal jurisprudence, And though it had nothing in statute, either in the Evidence Act or in the Code of Criminal Procedure, this presumption of innocence is recognized by the International Covenant uh, on Civil and Political Rights, that is Article 14.2. Then again, just I will mention brief. When we speak that he has got a right to be informed in a language which he understands, what is the nature of the charge against him, that is in Article 14.3 of the ICCPR and in sections 207 and 208 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Then, of course, adequate time and facilities for the preparation of the defense and to communicate counsel, they are to be given, because these are the guarantee of fair trial. That is Article 14.3 of the ICCPR and Section 304 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Incidentally, you can find out this Article 13A, 14 and 21 of the Constitution also. Then again, the most important right to be tried in one's presence. You can't try an accused behind his back. It cannot be done that you just record evidence behind him and pronounce that he is guilty. There is a provision under Section 299 of the Code of Criminal Procedure which permits a judge or a magistrate to record evidence in the absence of an accused. But when the accused is caught and if the witness is available, the witness is to be called. It is only if the witness is not available at that time, then the evidence so recorded may be taken into consideration. This is meant to, strike a balance, because sometimes some shrewd accused deliberately absconds and he just wants to see what happens to the trial that is proceeding against other accused. He tries to keep himself away. The police are unable to find him. And in that case, the court cannot just wait indefinitely for the other accused. So the trial is separated. Against absconding accused, there is a provision that evidence can be recorded in his absence. But as I said, the use of such evidence is again kept limited. Now, of course, double jeopardy and all that, you know that. Now, which factors actually violate human right? That is, if the fair trial is not held, then of course you have to say that human rights are violated. That's a violation of human rights. Now, what are the factors which affect these trials? In practice, I have seen often that there is some prejudice in the mind of the trying judge. Now, these prejudices may be due to various reasons, including the nature of the offense. And that is why the judge has to be very careful in maintaining the objectivity. I will tell you one interesting thing. When Osborne, there is, I often tell that because I am fully convinced that what he said is correct. There is an American author. He was not a lawyer. He was a document examiner, an expert witness. But he was very much acquainted with the court procedures because he used to be called as a witness. And he has written a book, The Problem of Proof. I would recommend it for every lawyer and every judge. That book, at least once it must be read, The Problem of Proof by Osborne. So in that, what he has said, that in every trial, there are two witnesses whose testimony is never recorded. But that testimony has got a great bearing on the ultimate result, that is a decision of acquittal and conviction. And he said these two witnesses are Mr. Prejudice and Miss Sympathy. He said that sympathy for the victim and the prejudice for the accused, these are always weighed by the courts, though they are subconsciously, nobody does it deliberately. But the judges must guard against that, and the advocates have to see that the judge does not lose his objectivity, and they must make such arguments, persuade the judge to be objective irrespective of the nature of the offense. In spite of my experience in dealing with criminal matters, I must confess that sometimes I also feel, because the nature of the offense is such that you immediately feel so much repulsion and all that, you feel, it is so disgusted But of course, when you are trying, you are not to lose your objectivity, and if there is no evidence, a person has to be acquitted, and one should not feel anything. Hello, hello.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Can
sir.
you hear? Yeah.
So, do we take the questions?
No, no, no. Just I will conclude with.
No. I thought that I was also thinking that the question it was a draft. Yes, sir. So your video.
Just I will. Something has happened. I will just. Yeah. Hello.
Sir, it's audible, but video is not there.
Now.
No, video is not there. Audible. Yes, you are. Yes, now it's fine.
Yeah, you can see me also. Now, in recent times, I find a new problem. And I'm mentioning this specifically because we have to discuss the criminal justice system, the ills affecting the criminal justice system in the context of the violation of human rights. So ultimately, we have to come to the fair trial. And this new aspect, according to me, is the publicity by media. Projecting a particular opinion before a case even starts. And I'm sure that this affects the judges very much. This is particularly because of social media. People say so many things. Many times I've tried such matters later on, and I found that what was even reported in press was totally different from what actually was in the evidence. I had the misfortune of trying a brother judge in a session court when I was in the sessions court. And I must confess that even I had some prejudice, because there used to be daily reports in a newspaper, a renowned newspaper. I can name the newspaper also, Times of India. And these newspapers get the information from the police or the investigating agencies always. No accused tries to go and proclaim his innocence. Even if he is innocent, he doesn't like to discuss the things with press at that stage. But so this information is basically given by the investigating agency. And what they used to do on the first page of Times of India, I have seen, they used to report some conversation. There the allegation was that the judge had spoken to a gangster, the leader of the organized crime syndicate, and had asked some favor from him by committing some offense. So there what had happened, they used to reproduce the conversation between the judge and the person who was supposed to be the leader of the organized crime syndicate. He was abroad. I don't want to name him. Names are not important. So the conversation used to be published, that judge and this, as if, they are giving a verbatim record. And when the tape was played before me, when I tried it, I found that most of the things which were there did not exist at all in that tape. So this is what happens with impunity. The police fabricate evidence. One doesn't know whether actually he had spoken or not. But the fact remains that the evidence of that was not proper. It was illegally obtained. There was no sanction taken for the telephone tapping. There was no proper identification of the voice of that person, nor was there anything to show that he was really a leader of an organized crime syndicate. I'm just giving you as an by way of example that how this publicity can affect your views. And this person was detained without granting bail, though he was a session judge, for 26 months. Even I did not grant him bail, I must tell you, because he had failed earlier in the Supreme Court also. And when he was acquitted ultimately by me, and those who have dealt with serious cases, you will understand that such appeals are never summarily dismissed. Particularly, it was a case under the Organized Crime Control Act. So the appeal was summarily dismissed, even to my surprise. Means it was such a worthless case that there was no evidence, but a person of a session judge's stature had to remain in custody. This was an example of serious violation of human rights. And it was, I would say, there were two reasons. One, the judges did not want to be seen as favoring their fellow colleague of theirs. And second, the tremendous publicity given by media. But I am sure in that case, it had resulted in miscarriage of justice. The SLP was also, I don't know what happened to the SLP, but the decision of the Bombay High Court stood.
So only for a minute, I would just highlight, taking cue from that. Tomorrow, in fact, we have a session on this thing only, webinar on rights of the press, versus rights of the accused, freedom of press versus rights of the accused by Adar Panda, senior advocate from Mumbai only. He will be speaking on this tomorrow.
Yeah. Abad Ponda, I know him.
Yeah.
So I would only say that you can't remove this because judges are human beings. But if we recognize that there exists a bias can exist, and therefore we have to be careful if we are conscious of this fact that we may subconsciously be biased. If we recognize that fact, then there is a lesser possibility of actually the bias playing any role in the decision making. Now, there are certain things. Now, bail, of course, if you see the judgments of the earlier days, bail was being granted more liberally, and it should be that way, according to me. But what has happened? Because of the delay in trials, a feeling is generated that the offenses, the offenders are not punished at all. And therefore, all said and done, and though accepting in theory that bail is never to be refused as punishment before trial is being imposed, in practice, I see that the courts are just doing the opposite of that. And they are actually not granting bail just to give the accused a taste of a punishment. But this is not a very scientific approach, because at that time his guilt is not proved. These agencies, particularly, I'm not talking about the ordinary criminal cases where probably the police arrest only the person who is found guilty. I'm speaking about the cases investigated into by these national agencies where the crime is supposed to be big, number of accused very high. There are the status of the accused also is different. They have their friends and enemies both in the investigating agencies or in political circles, and therefore it is not necessary that only truth comes out before the court. There are ways and means of deceiving the court in actually projecting what a person has done. So this criminal justice system now, I just would say, I just explained to you how the provisions are all there. But it is my personal view that often there has been a violation of these provisions and violation of human rights. Particularly, many of you may not be aware of this also, that there is a bar of handcuffing the prisoners. The first case in that would be Batra's case. That is in 78, I think Sudhir Batra. And there is another case of 1980, Sudhir Batra, then Prem Shankar Shukla. Categorically, it was said that these police cannot handcuff the prisoners. And if they have to handcuff, they have to take permission of the magistrate. In fact, a later judgment by Justice Kuldeep Singh, maybe Citizens for Democracy, I don't remember, in 92 or 93, it says that it is the duty of the magistrate to inquire every prisoner, every person who is brought before him at the time of remand, whether he had been handcuffed, and make a record. But I see that this is not being followed at all. Nobody asked. When I was a principal district judge, I had reminded the judges of this judgment. And I think then after being reminded, but many judges are not aware of this. Handcuffing is, serious violation of human rights. Only in cases of very violent or aggressive accused, handcuffing can be permitted, and that too till the time is taken to the court. Usually you will see this handcuffing doesn't take place in case of big offenders. I had seen very notorious criminals, they were never handcuffed. They used to be brought with all their dignity in the court. But I have seen poor people, like in Gambling Act, is traveling without a railway ticket or entering railway platform. They are all tied by a rope. Many of you might have seen this. This is a very common thing. Tied by a rope and dragged by road on feet to the court. Now, everybody looks at them and, that is a very serious violation of human rights. The problem is that the violations often take place with respect to the poor, where the offenses are very simple. I have seen such things many times. Once I was late in going to the court and I saw people were being brought to my court, all tied by a rope. And then I had to take appropriate action. But on the other hand, I have seen very notorious criminals. They are brought with tremendous respect, I would say. In fact, I don't want to burden, but this is now since I am retired, I can speak more frankly. Once there was a gangster whose case was before me. He was projected as a dreaded gangster. And then he used to sit in the advocate's canteen, and some advocates complained. So I told the canteen wala that why you are allowing him. He said, I am afraid of him. So I said, you put a board there only for advocates. And so that man was wise enough to understand. He stopped coming. Then once I was late, as I said, and I saw that he was standing in the compound of the court and the police were bringing tea and snacks from the canteen and serving him. I immediately telephoned to the police commissioner and told him. He wanted the names. I said, I am not interested in the names of the... This is what happens. For this, you assault others, you tie them by ropes, and to this man, your policemen are serving. They are bringing from the canteen and serving him, and they are in uniform. I mean, in front of everybody, so many people, the witnesses, all this is happening. What will happen to the trial? Tell me. So there are so many things which I can tell you from personal experience, but what I need to emphasize is the violation of human rights which takes place mostly in case of poor. Of course, in case of these eminent persons also, it can take place where the state is interested in the outcome of those cases, or where it is projected as because after all, the state is the most powerful than any other individual. If the state wants to use its might and get personally involved in a tussle with the criminal, then the state will be sued. And in such cases, even in such cases, there will be violation of human rights. What I would suggest that the judges should be true to their role. It is not the concern of the judges to control crime, and they are not to be guided by this factor that the crime is prevalent. That is a matter to be considered by the executive. What I would think, I would end with this, that the judges are to be reminded of the principles and the provisions in the Code of Criminal Procedure, which are all based on human rights. If the violation is not taken seriously, the only reason which I can perceive is that the judges don't actually appreciate these principles as correct principles. Like that, a judge may not be able to feel that presumption of innocence is a proper principle, or benefit of doubt is a proper principle. Then we should have a debate on that. And if the principles are wrong, then we may better change the principles rather than acting contrary to the principles while maintaining that these principles are good. I was returning once with my colleagues from a seminar on human rights when I was a magistrate. And then all were complaining after that. It was organized by a reputed institution, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And everybody was critical of those who said why these criminals should be pampered and why they should be given such a soft treatment. So the entire thing was a waste, according to me, if while returning you are expressing such views. So the violations took, according to me, because you have no real faith in those principles. If that is so, as an honest person, one must see how this principle was evolved for. One must realize that the presumption of innocence is not invented by the criminals. The law or the principle is not invented by criminals. The benefit of that principle, it is invented by us only from experience. It is not that all the criminals gathered together and they said that accused should have a right to be silent. Accused should have, this is not, had that been the position, we justified in seriously challenging the principles, but it has not happened that way. Nowadays, the victims, of course, the victims' rights were neglected. The machinery doesn't act honestly. And many times, a genuine victim suffers. I have seen the key witness not even summoned and the accused being acquitted because of that. But the extreme, the other side, the views dominate on the stage of bail. That is also not correct, because the victim is not expected to be objective. His role should be limited to bringing the facts before the court. But it is not uncommon nowadays that the victims, particularly in a fraud case, 200, 300, gather in a large number in the court, and their presence itself is frightening. There are judges who would not succumb to such pressures, but I can't pretend that there are no judges who will succumb to these pressures. It comes up. And when this is added by a feeling that what you are doing is justice, you are helping many people, then of course you find a justification also for violating from your normal procedures. So friends, I think we had enough discussion on this, which was not regarding any particular incident or a particular provision. What I tried to explain is that all the human rights are already included in the criminal justice system, the procedural law and the law of evidence which we follow. But in practice, there are violations for various reasons. And we must therefore have faith in these systems, We must have a faith about the correctness of these human rights. We must have faith that these are necessary in order to live in a better society. Ultimately, I will only end by saying that a crimeless society is not necessarily the best society to live in. There are societies where crime rate was almost zero, but people were trying to run away from there. So attributes of good life are not necessarily that there is no crime in the society. It is not necessary that if you punish every offender, then you are living a better life. You are leading. See, there are other attributes. You should be able to live comfortably. You should be able to express your thoughts. Somebody had said that, that if there is a policeman behind every person, then probably there will be no crime. But how many people will like that? So these, friends, is my abstract thoughts coming mostly from my experiences and my reading and the judgments of the Supreme Court. Thanks for inviting me. And I really once again congratulate the Beyond Law organization for organizing such webinars.
It's in fact a pleasure on our side that sometimes what we have in a webinar or a seminar, that one has a knowledge that is theoretical, one is having a knowledge of a practical.
No, I tried to combine both, but more on the practical side. Yeah.
And like we all go to the food courts, they say that the combos are actually are selling well because a knowledge of a practical plus theoretical combination of the both gives the different insights. So we have got the questions. Since Justice Roshan Dalvi is also there, we would also ask her to give the insights on the questions, because the company of two judges on any aspect will be a good session. So this is by saying, if a matrimonial dispute is going on, does a father has a right to see his child? If the child is with the wife, would it come in the violation of the human rights of the kid to get loved by both, or both, and also not a right of father to see the child as he's a father?
Well, whom do you want this to answer? I think Roshan is more suited because she has dealt with such
I know that ma'am has a specialization on the gender law. In fact, she's again coming on Sunday to express her views with Justice Maushmi Bhattacharya and Justice Shalini on gender law.
Yes. She has more knowledge on certainly on these aspects.
We will have.
He was in the family court also.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Well, Vikas, this is not the question pertinent to this subject.
That's true.
They should ask questions relating to the subject for which the speaker has chosen. Otherwise, you come and take legal advice and every webinar. It is not a disciplined thing to do. But of course, now we are having what is called the joint custody. In fact, there should be a webinar on this. That, you see, a child is entitled to have the company of both the father and the mother equally. Every child wants that. So what they say is, you may be divided in matrimony, but you should be united in child parenting. And if you follow this principle, which may even come in our by our legislature now, they are contemplating a law on joint custody. And therefore, what we say is that father, generally it is the father, but sometimes it is the mother also, who is the non-custodial parent, must have access to his child. It is not the father's right. It is not the right of either of the parents. It is the child's company of the parents. And this is a completely different subject. We can talk for 1 hour on this subject because it's a very fragile subject. And it would be a part of your, the series of
gender law sensitization. Gender law sensitization.
Oh, and Roshan has got a number of things she can tell. Some of
gender perspective.
She has written in her books also some of that, some of those experiences.
Yes. There's a whole chapter on child custody in my book. And I have written about 5 cases that I have done with.
Point well taken. We will do on child custody also, and people are actually interested because the dispute qua husband and wife, what you said, the differences in the matrimonial shouldn't affect the child, number one. And what are the rights flowing as to how the child right, how the duty comes. But taking cue from you, Naveen Kumar says it's a topic related with Justice Thipse. Why is the police or investigating agency allowed to disclose or discuss the details of an investigation or evidence, etc. to media? Shouldn't the police be prosecuted for violation of Article 21, right to fair trial and right of reputation, from presumption of innocence until proven guilty? What is your call on that?
See, I don't think that there is any law which prohibits the police from publishing the details of their investigation. So that is the first part of that question. I would say that there is no prohibition made by any express law. The question is of fairness. Now, the police would claim that we are only disclosing the details of the investigation which we are carrying out. And the press also would be justified in saying that being a matter of some public importance, we are publishing it. The question is that if there is no prohibition, it is not possible to punish them under any law, obviously. Now, the question of propriety has to be tackled by the police department as such. And I think departmentally, there are guidelines that they should not disclose or they should not divulge information, but these guidelines are often violated. This reminds me of one case. In one case, what had happened is that there was some alleged seizure of some arms. And the police commissioner was quick to hold a press conference on TV, and it was displayed on TV. Then he that these are the weapons, weapons were displayed on TV. And when the trial started, this point was taken because those clips were obtained. And the case of the prosecution, naturally, as you know, if you are practicing on criminal side, that we seized that under a Panchanama and sealed them and all that was there as usual. And if it was sealed at that time, then how could in the evening the police commissioner disclose this? That was the point raised before the trial court, and it had its effect, saying that this was the Panchanama was a fake Panchanama prima facie, because at that time there was no seizure at all. These documents, these arms were freely available. So this is what the police should be mindful of, this, that they will be spoiling their own case. But unfortunately nowadays publicity weighs with some people. They like to be in the light. Like encounters, I did not deliberately touch the subject of encounter, the most serious violation of human rights. Many people know, but I come across educated people who say that the encounters are justified. Now, if that is the attitude, first we have to start with that, that to convince people that this is bad. Many people already know that these encounters are fake, but feel that the criminals cannot be tackled in any other way. Now, I don't agree with that, and no legal person will agree. It's so the police, if it becomes, it is for the legislature to consider whether a law should be brought, bringing some restriction on the police for disclosing the information which they receive during the investigation and before a charge sheet is filed in court. Once charge sheet is filed, of course, an allegation is made formally, and at that time, nobody can object to it being published, except for certain offenses for which we have provisions in the act itself, like rape and all that, where the victim's name is not to be disclosed, etc. Some trials are to be held in camera. So the police are acting with impropriety, and it is for their department to deal with that, such improper conduct.
So it is an interwoven question. Avinash says, asking the victim a compensation as one of the conditions for an anticipatory bail, is it a violation of human rights or not?
Well, I don't say that human rights cannot be violated by the court at all, but any generalization cannot be done. I mean, see, you are coming to the court for anticipatory bail. The judge may not feel that this is a fit case to grant anticipatory bail. At the same time, the judge may feel that provided the victim is compensated in some way which affects some change in the situation, then a person may be allowed to avail of the liberty. So this all depends on the conversation that would take place between the counsel and the court at that time. I don't think any judge will compel you to do that. But often it happens that the counsel himself comes forward because he wants bail desperately at that time. So he says that I will deposit or I will compensate. And then if that has happened and if the judge has based the relief of bail on that basis, then he can't subsequently challenge. In fact, I have seen such cases where the person agreed before the sessions court and the session court has mentioned in the order, and then revision or writ was filed before me or a petition under 482 that this is violative of my rights. Because so I said, all right, you don't want the order, you don't take the order, go in custody and argue before the judge that I don't want to pay compensation. Now you decide my application without that aspect. See, the accused has got a right to have his application decided favorably. I mean, he has got a right to have it decided in accordance with merits. Now, he may get bail, anticipatory bail, or he may not get it. So, I mean, the exact answer to that, if the judge forces you to give compensation as a precondition for release on bail or anticipatory bail, then that is not correct. But if you are ready, in a case where you are finding it difficult to get bail, where you offer yourself to voluntarily do some act which will compensate or reduce some problems of the victim, then if that is taken into consideration by the judge, then there is nothing wrong. I don't think there is a violation. In fact, I will say that this is a sort of understanding between the accused, court, and the victim, that the person gets bail and the victim is also not, I mean, grievances to a certain extent are redressed at that stage itself.
In fact, what on the child custody, we have District Judge from Coimbatore, A.S. Ravi, he has given the insights. He says that the Supreme Court said family court should grant visitation rights in such a manner that the child is not deprived of the love and care of either parents. A child has the right of affection of both the parents.
Yeah, but I believe that the courts are doing that as far as possible. Yeah.
So let me see. Pawan, he says, is it not against the human rights if the remanded accused is asked to remove his clothes and sit naked before the entering into the prison? This practice I have come to know from my clients as a prevailing in Hyderabad.
No, it's of course a very serious violation. I did not speak much about the prisons because we have some time limit and then one can't go astray totally because every subject is. See, prisons is the worst place that I've seen. It is probably the worst place where violation of human rights is a normal thing. It is believed that there are no human rights at all. And this is worse than the police station. Many people, many advocates, many accused have told me. I have also read some literature, even prison reforms were suggested. I see prison, you totally feel helpless, and therefore the atrocities are more. Even women are raped in police custody as well as in prison. It's not a safe place. There is very obvious answer. That's a very serious violation of human rights if he's asked to sit naked and all that. But this complaint has to be made before the judge whenever he is produced.
So Ravi has again pasted it on the chat box. He says that bail can neither be a punitive instrument nor a preventive measure, and it shouldn't be held as a means of punishment. That is his take.
No, that's correct. That is a settled position. Nobody has ever tried to change this principle.
So rest of the questions is basically again on that maintenance part. He says whether the compensation being assessed without there being evidence, will it be a human right violation or not?
See, see, human right violation means the court will, on the basis of whatever material, if an assessment is made by the court that what is the compensation, that can be broadly worked out. And if it is relating to the earlier question which you asked, I think these things are done in the open court. When the judge is fixing the amount of compensation, that is known within the sight of the accused, within the hearing of his advocate, and within the presence of everybody. So that time you can suggest also that this is more. I have seen that used to happen in many courts, even when I was practicing and when I was a judge also. You may say, no, this is, even if fine, the courts do say that, we say, okay, this bail, say 50,000. He says, no, no, sir, this he can't do. Okay, all right, 30. So these are matters which are discretionary. The judge gives a fair hearing and comes to a conclusion which according to him or her is fair. So there is no question of violation of human rights as such in this. If you are not heard at all by the court, then that may be, but we basically don't consider that the court's orders can be I mean such a drastically wrong that they involve the violation of human rights. That can happen when the procedural safeguards are not followed by the court.
So I don't think we are getting more on human rights. But since Ma'am Dalvi is there and you are there, this is again with maintenance. It says, what can be done about preventing a jail of whole year when person is unable to pay the maintenance?
So, maintenance is an order of the court. You do not pay maintenance, you made a breach of that order. When there is a breach, it is a contempt. Everything that you cannot do under the law cannot go under the garb of human rights. Otherwise, all the defaulters will have human rights. And then what happens to the human rights of the wife who is entitled to maintenance, and the court holds that she is entitled to a particular amount of maintenance? She's got to be paid. Because if that is not paid for breach of the order, there is a specific legislation that you should be committed to civil prison.
In fact, the questions which are coming on maintenance, etc.
Like for example, you murder, and you say for murder you are getting either life or death. Now, is that not a breach of human rights? Because if I get death, I don't have my life. But you murdered. So every punishment is not a breach of human rights.
No, that is what before Roshan you came, I told them that you have to conflict. I mean, we have a criminal justice system meant for prevention of offenses and for punishing the offenders. And as far as punishment is concerned, it will be a violation of human rights to that extent. So that is permissible. So they will not be absolute in that sense, because we don't deprive them of their rights by some arbitrary procedure. We deprive them by the procedure which is regular, fair, just and reasonable. But maintenance under the Code of Criminal Procedure also is there under section 125. And there is a provision that if there is a willful default, then only he can be imprisoned. Means if there is a default, his properties can be attached and maintenance is to be paid to that. But if he is to be punished by detaining in prison, then there should be a willful default, and such person is entitled to be heard before the court. It is not that arbitrarily the court is saying that you did not pay to the jail. It doesn't happen that way. The person can prove that, suppose something, courts I have seen have been kind enough, because the courts are also primarily don't want to punish the husband. They want that the wife should get the maintenance. Even installments are granted, time is given. So it is only when a judge is convinced that there is some deliberate mischief or some obstinate stand that come what may, sometimes it becomes a prestige issue for the husband. So in such cases, the court has to come down heavily and see that the payment is enforced.
So we won't be taking any questions, but I am reminded the way questions have been juxtaposed of maintenance along with human rights. I'm just reminded that what we say in the powers under Article 226 and 227, they say that whatever you cannot plead, ask anything, you can ask in 226 and 227, anything under the sky and under the earth you can ask. The same way human rights people try to elaborate it in such an extent that they believe that whatever it is to be there, it can be.
No, I think from so many questions about maintenance, I think many husbands are aggrieved because of the maintenance orders. That seems to be the case.
That's it.
But they have got remedies. They have got remedies of approaching the higher courts, and there are remedies provided by law. Yeah.
That's true.
One just cannot arbitrarily decide that. Of course, you have the remedies and you avail of those remedies.
Sir, we are thankful for the insights given by you on a topic on human rights, especially during these testing times. It has been an eye-opener on a large number of aspects. And we're also thankful that Justice Roshan Dalvi and the District Judge A.S. Ravi joined, because, and we have Rashmi, I will see if the Dean of the Shobit University, before we call for the day. If she's there, I would ask her to propose a vote of thanks. And tomorrow, as taking cue as things would have been, tomorrow, as my lords were saying, that you should have some restraint of the control. Tomorrow, we are having a webinar of freedom of press versus rights of accused. Both the judges, that is Justice Roshan Dalvi and Justice Hipse, know very well, and others also know. The insights will be given by Adab Ponda, the senior advocate, for friends who are, for them who do not know much about him. Otherwise, he's a leading lawyer and he has represented many celebrities like Devanand, Salman Khan, John Abraham, Jignesh Shah, Rana Kapoor, Rakhi Gulzar, Dimple Kapadia, Sunita Kapoor, Payal Tyagi, Nusli Wadia, and Priti Zinta. The fact that we had asked him that he should give, because we said that once you are representing the celebrities, so what is the balance to be maintained between how the press has to be maintained and whether there is violation of what we say, rights, etc. So tomorrow, do stay connected with us. Rashmi is there. So thank you, friends, for joining us. And thank you again, sir, for giving the insightful insights to the topic. And as I said to Justice Roshan Dalvi, though even the topic was of human rights, but we got the questions of the maintenance. Justice Roshan Dalvi has been on our platform, and she knows that these questions are raised up, and we are happy with that, though it is not sometimes with the subject. But we are happy that judges of your caliber and knowledge give their insights, and it becomes, and that is why people are attracted, even though the topic is different, they sometimes feel that this topic could be taken up. And we also believe in the time constraint and then move forward. Everyone stay safe, stay connected, and we would request Justice Hepse to give the insights of some other topic. It was an engaging session for time, and we never realized how the time flew. Everyone stay safe. Again, thank you. Namaskar,
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Thank you, Vikas.
Thanks.
Meet again. We'll meet again. Yeah.
Right.
I leave.